Thank you all so much for being here. That's really loud, right? Okay. I'm Rebecca. My last name is meaningless, but I am part of this group called Affordable Housing Hudson, and this is the third public forum that we've held on issues that directly affect affordable housing issues in Hudson. And I guess, well, one of the things I wanted to say about tonight is that I'm hoping that this might be a first with at least one follow-up meeting about questions around Airbnb and how it does affect the quantity of housing, essentially, available housing. So the title of this this evening is Airbnb, Who Are You and What Are You Doing to My City? You will notice the personal nature of the title. At heart, the issues around Airbnb have to do with two things: affordable housing and the personality or impersonality of our city. I've taken the liberty of writing a short personal essay. I'm going to read that, and then I'm going to introduce our speakers and facilitator. The essay, it's pretty short. It's called Won't You Be My Neighbor? And it's B-E-E. I hope you find it amusing. If not, just close your eyes. I bought my house at 110 Union Street in 2012 after living in one of its two apartments as a tenant for about a year. In buying the house, I became a landlord. I decided not to Airbnb the apartment, but rather to lease it at a reasonable rent. About a year later, the other side of the house, a single-family dwelling with which my house shares a wall, was sold to a woman who, I was told, lived in the city but would be using the house on weekends. One day, my daughter and I were out in our backyard, which is shared without a fence or any other line. We habitually stay on our side of the yard, and I have put in a flower garden, a rabbit hutch, and a compost. We were sitting in the sun, and my daughter was telling me about how she had just learned in school that the bumblebees were being threatened by human pesticide use, and I was trying to explain to her the concept of short-sightedness, how people often have a hard time imagining the future or understanding the extent to which their actions now will affect that future. This is certainly a driving force of capitalism and consumerism, to allow change, even negative change, at the cost of qualities of life that are absolutely positive, such as the pollination of plants. We were sitting there talking about this when into the yard came two strangers, our new neighbors. We began chatting cordially. They asked about their half of the yard and why grass wasn't growing as lushly as it does on mine. I offered that it might be because of the large tree overshadowing their half from the yard adjacent, but the boyfriend said that he thought it was because of weed overgrowth and stated that it was nothing a couple of treatments with Roundup couldn't handle. Later, we mended fences, and on one of their infrequent weekends in Hudson had drinks. But after about 6 months of their ownership, it became clear that I wasn't going to have to worry too much about any neighborly activities, constructive or destructive, because they actually did not have any plans to live in the house. They took down some old shingles, slapped some vinyl siding over them, and then they proceeded to Airbnb the shit out of that house. They charged $348 per night. They only mow what grass they have when they are going to have the guests. And as of about a month ago, they have not registered for the lodging tax. The house mostly sits empty. They put it on the market a couple of years ago at an exorbitant price and have since lowered it. Sometimes I take pity on them and let them know that weeds are growing out of every crack in their front stoop. I still have hope someone might buy the house and actually live in it. I have performed neighborly duties for them, such as texting them when their back door or sometimes front door is left hanging wide open for more than a day by a careless guest or by the cleaning crew that are the only familiar faces to me. Right now, and for the past few days, the light in their bedroom has been left on. You can see it from my back porch, which adjoins their back porch. The metaphor is too obvious. The light is on, but no one's home. Just as the bee metaphor was all about stewardship of one's environment and one's community. It is arguable, I suppose, whether the quality of personality, the opposite of impersonality, is an absolutely positive one and to be preserved. However, there is data to support the idea that Hudson is getting shorter and shorter on affordable and workforce housing, and longer on housing we might call luxury, even though it may be quite humble in its appointments. Our subject of concern tonight, and I hope for the foreseeable future, is curtailing with all available tools what is in many cities an illegal usage of property, short-term rental of an unowner-occupied dwelling. One thing that is not arguable is that every single unit that could be available for long-term lease, but that is instead being used for Airbnb, is one less permanent working member of our community, one more visitor. I'm asking us to consider tonight what kind of city we, who really live in Hudson, really want to live in. That's it. Thank you. So I'm going to introduce Michael O'Hara, who's, well, this is not in order of appearance, Michael O'Hara, who's First Ward Alderman. Bill McKenna is the Town Supervisor of Woodstock, New York. Our facilitator tonight is Michael Shimidas. He's the former chair of the Democratic Committee and is running for 3rd Ward County Supervisor. Please welcome them.
Well, thanks everybody for coming, and thank you to the Youth Center for hosting us. As Rebecca pointed out, this is a really personal issue, and it's also an issue that really means a lot to the city, and it means a lot to me to see you all here and really engaging with what is the future of our city. So the plan for for the evening is that Bill is going to speak a little bit about the experience of working to curtail Airbnb, or specific kinds of Airbnb maybe, in Woodstock. And then Michael's going to talk a little bit about sort of some of the some of the ongoing projects in Hudson that the City Council is addressing. So both of them will speak. I might interject a little bit in between each one of those, and then we'll open it up for the floor for questions and comments. All right, well, thanks a lot.
Can everybody hear me without the mic?
Yeah.
That good? So I came here this evening with not really a prepared statement or an agenda, but just some random thoughts. I want to start by saying that Woodstock has not found the solution. We're still searching for answers, just like you folks are here. When I got here tonight, I was scrolling through Facebook trying to find, just the other day, I came across one of these top 10 places in New York to visit and whatnot. And I happened to notice that your community, Hudson, and my community, Woodstock, were both listed there as places to go and visit. And these surveys are all great, but it's sending more and more people our way. And that is a real mixed blessing. Woodstock has always had an enormous problem with affordable housing. And we're a very democratic town. Everybody talks about how great it is, but nobody wants it in their backyard. So we always get bogged down with trying to bring it about. The B&B situation has not made it any easier. We were very fortunate that the writers of our zoning law back in the early 80s had, it wasn't even forethought, but they stumbled upon it, I guess, where they put in a couple of different definitions and restrictions and a caveat that says, basically, if it ain't in the use table, it ain't allowed. And so short-term rentals in Woodstock are really not legal, according to our zoning. We do have a couple of exceptions. Of course, we have some motels and hotels that are all pretty small and limited, although we've seen a boom in the last I think right now I have one 24-unit being built. I have another 20-unit motel that's in some stage of construction, and yet another 9-room boutique that's just started the planning process. This after many years of really only having one motel in town. So people do see that there's money to be made in short-term rentals. We also do allow B&Bs. Both the B&Bs and the motels, hotels have to be permitted though. In the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen an uptick in the Airbnb and HomeAway platform. Somebody gave me a count that there were about 800 homes in Woodstock that were listed on the different platforms. Yeah, wow.
800 rooms or 800 homes?
Homes.
So the home, are you sure?
Yes.
Because it's a lot of times it's listed by rooms.
No, I didn't do the count, but this came from fairly reliable sources.
That's a lot.
It's an enormous amount. One of the other...
I live in my house. How many homes are available? Like, what percentage of that?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you that in Woodstock, for many, many years, and this isn't a totally accurate gauge, but we send 60% of our tax bills out of town, which indicates to us that roughly 60% of the homes, which I believe is about 3,500, are lived in by second homers, weekenders, and whatnot. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when I first started going to Woodstock as a young person from Saugerty, from the next town over, and, in the wintertime, the town would almost close up. All the weekenders were summer people, and they'd all head home, and you wouldn't see them until the spring came. As people got more involved in sport, winter sports and whatnot, we started to see an increase in those folks coming around. But lately what we've seen is an influx of, I call them young people from Brooklyn, young couples, and a lot of them seem to be from Brooklyn, and I was born there too, so I'm not prejudiced against them. But they're coming up, they're couples with decent incomes who can't afford $1 million or $2 million to buy a home in Brooklyn, but they want to invest in a home, like many of us have done over the years. So they see spending $500,000 in Woodstock as a bargain. And what's even worse is that we do have a couple of real estate brokers who will turn around and show them a home for $600,000. They'll say, that's out of my price range, and they say, Airbnb it 2 weekends a month, and you've got that extra payment. And so that's what's happening. We've seen an uptick due to that. What really scares me about that is that if the economy does turn around and we start to see a drop, and all these young people are counting on that 1 or 2 weekends a month to pay their mortgage and they don't get it, that we're going to see a flood in the market of homes that they can't afford to keep, which makes me a little anxious. So I keep my fingers crossed on that one. Over the last couple of years, the former supervisor who passed away in January, he and I had discussed this issue about tightening down more on it. Because one of the, a lot of the complaints, and I lived across the street from one, we got noise. I used to have an issue where you'd get 5 or 6 cars coming up to this 5-bedroom house with a pool, and they'd come in Friday night in the dark and they'd start to party, and by 2 o'clock they were just getting rolling. And they were oblivious to anyone else in the community. They'd come in the dark, they didn't see the other homes. This went on for an entire summer. I finally, through discussions with the property owner, was able to convince him that it would be better to rent for the summer, which he did, and that worked out much better. There was a young girl that used to come up for the summer with her parents, and Saturday afternoon she'd be out in the pool yelling and screaming, and that was all good. It was fine. But we've seen an uptick again in the renting out for the weekends. Garbage, parking issues, traffic in town, and none of this is bringing any tax dollars. In Ulster County, we don't have yet, they're not collecting sales tax on it, and they're not collecting the pillow tax on it, which we've been pushing for, because there's a mechanism there for them to do it. It's become some political battle above my head where one guy says we can do it, the other guy says no, we need a state law. So, you know, we're still stuck with that and not seeing any income from it. The one other thing I would suggest to your town, I started to say before, one night at a meeting in desperation, I suggested, and perhaps the paper took it out of context a little bit, that we should just ban them all. The next day I got an email from an attorney from Airbnb. He said that it wasn't the article, but at some point later on he did admit that, yeah, they did do Google searches periodically to check and see what was going on. He was fairly helpful in, they don't want to see Airbnb banned. They want to see their business thrive, but they also are not opposed to seeing it regulated, because regulating it makes it legal. So if a community has regulations, they're safe. They play by the rules, and that's fine. I know down in New York City, they just banned them altogether. And we'll see. I'm sure that's going to end up in court. But we had several phone conferences, and I would urge you to do the same thing. I can get you their contact information. About 6 months ago, I appointed, 3 months ago, I appointed a committee to take a look at this. Let me step back actually for a minute. We are on the cusp of doing a comprehensive plan in our community. And like everything in government, it dragged on a little longer and took longer to get put in place. But we had hoped that this comprehensive plan would give us some guidance as to whether people wanted it or not. Because for a long time, we didn't know. There's definitely an upside to it. You know, it brings people to town. We are a tourist community. But the downside is we're losing homes for our more affordable housing units. Everybody's Airbnb-ing them out. We did try and wait and hold off, and finally the comp plan was just coming too slowly. But it also became apparent that most people wanted regulations. And even those people doing Airbnb or home away, any of the short-term, they were even acknowledged that, yes, this could all be good. Permitting, inspections, and some limitations. So it seemed like the bulk of the town was willing to accept this, so we're in the process of coming up with some plans. I had a brief conversation with the chairman of that committee today, and what they're looking at doing is some type of permitting system where people would come in, we'd have a checklist of parking requirements, garbage. We would probably most likely want to have somebody available locally, a key holder, regulations on noise and partying, limitations on those, and a fee schedule. And it'll probably be a sliding scale based on the number of bedrooms. So that's where we're at right now. So I think at this point I'll turn it over to Michael.
Or you can invite questions.
If there's questions now, yeah, I'm happy to.
Hi there. I'm a Hudson resident. I own 3 properties on State Street. One is my personal residence, one is Airbnb, and one is a market rate rental. So I had kind of have experience from all 3 perspectives. What I wanted to say is, first of all, if you're going to do this panel, you should have invited Airbnb.
Not my panel.
Okay. Whoever set up this panel should have also invited Airbnb hosts from Hudson to offer a more balanced perspective. Secondly, I don't think your experience in Woodstock is quite as relevant to Hudson, because Hudson has already instituted certain guidelines that that Woodstock is not, including the tax. Thirdly, if you go 45 minutes north from here, you go to Albany, and they're so depressed that they're practically giving away houses. So the issue in Hudson, if it's even an issue, is actually a very welcome one, because Hudson is becoming a destination. That means increased tax dollars, increased tourist spending.
If you speak up a little bit louder,
Sure,
you're right on target.
Oh, sorry about
Yeah,
that.
perhaps even stand up.
Oh, okay. So, I was saying that if you go north to Albany, that town is very depressed. And what you have in Hudson is you have a town that is actually experiencing a rush right now, where we have a lot of tourist dollars, a lot of hospitality business coming in, restaurants and everything like that. So I think the best solution is really regulation in terms of the Airbnbs. And I don't think it's really all about getting rid of the Airbnbs, because if what you're looking for is affordable housing, most of the residences being used for Airbnbs, if you remove the Airbnb regulation, that's not going to be affordable housing. It's going to be market rate housing. Because Airbnb renters, especially the people coming from Manhattan and Brooklyn, they're not looking for budget housing. Most of the Airbnb housing here it's considered probably luxury or market rate housing. So that's just something to take into account.
Okay, first off, I didn't set this.
Can we listen, can we follow the format and listen to Michael talk about what Hudson's doing?
I thought that's what.
Because then we'll all have the,
There we go.
sorry, but
Yes.
I just don't want to waste people's time.
Well, that's fine. All right. Hi, everybody. Michael O'Hara is my name. I work as the alderman for the First Ward for the city of Hudson. And I'm also the chair of the legal committee. We've been talking about housing in the context of some other issues that have come up in Hudson for some time. And while we have not presented a bill to the council which is specifically addressing the Airbnb problem, we have put forth, pardon me?
Why do we call it Airbnb problem?
Because it's
Can I hold on? I just want to
Kind
step in.
of jading the whole conversation. when
I
we
just
say
want
it's
to,
Airbnb.
I'm going to step in now.
The issue is
Michael's not going to talk for that
about
long,
housing.
and he's going to talk, and then you're going to have plenty of time to sort of reframe it. And you can argue with his word choice, but I think this event will go a lot better if Michael can just talk for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we can take as much questions from the floor as possible.
the Airbnb challenge that I think is why people have come here tonight involves a number of different stakeholders in our community, some of whom have benefited from the Airbnb system, which allows for a much much easier way to rent out a space for a short period of time and at a lower overhead than doing your own advertising. There's a lot positive to say about it as a system. However, there's a perception on the part of a lot of people that there's a competition of housing units between those which are used for, relatively speaking, just in general, longer-term housing, month by month or even year by year, and that which is allocated to daily housing. Now, the issue as presented to the council by people who have brought up a concern about housing and about lodging in general resulted earlier this year in the passage of the Hudson lodging tax. The lodging tax is the first step that we have to understanding, to get our arms around what is the pattern that's developing in the city. How many units are there? Who's renting them? What's the geographic distribution of those units? And how is that potentially going to be thought of as we analyze the numbers as time goes on? We're just getting started with the lodging tax. How is that going to be used in understanding how we might develop policies which support and regulate the use of this sort of lodging mechanism in the time to come? There's a lot we have to understand, and we're In some cases, looking to other communities, not just Woodstock, but communities all over the country that are talking about it in much the same way. Where are we at? Where would we like to go? And what are the stakeholders in this particular issue? So, not having presented anything to the council in regards to B&Bs other than the lodging tax, what we are working on is several different measures which are intended to either create a new platform for affordability for longer-term housing, and other issues which will potentially create a more inviting atmosphere for the development of new properties. And those are, and I had expected to have a projection ability here, but that's not appropriate for this layout. But in any case, one of the things we're actively working on is relief on off-street parking, which for certain units that have been developed in the city is a constraint on how many units can be occupied, which then has had to be coupled with an off-street parking space. We developed a fix, in a manner of speaking, to the zoning code, which is now in the planning board's hands for their review and approval, and that'll come back to the city council within the next month, and with barring any changes to that law, we'll go forward with that, and that ought to free up a few units right there for properties that might otherwise be constrained through the lack of ability to find parking for a given unit. The other stuff which we're considering is rezoning parts of the city so that they can accommodate a higher density of housing than they do today. Moving from, for example, a two-family zone to a potential 4-unit housing will do a whole lot for the possibility of developing properties that are in parts of the city that we think are ripe for that sort of development. Now, this would appropriately be taken up in the context of a comprehensive plan review, and that's another umbrella project that I think the city ought to take up within a relatively short time, so that we can do this in an organized way. The other stuff, the other issue that I think goes along with that is the clearing away obstacles to accessory dwelling units. Accessory dwelling units take advantage of something like a garage. Hudson has a lot of properties which open onto alleys, especially in the dense downtown area. And if you walk the alleys, as I do, you can see several units under development or already complete today that are garages with residences above them. So in the central core business district, this can be done with appropriate building permits and so forth right now. But outside of that district, where you have land, the percentage of property that can be used for building limitations, it's worth thinking about how those limitations might be adjusted to not only allow for, but actually clear the way and encourage the development of housing in places where we do not actually utilize as much of the land as we could. At the turn of the last century, Hudson had approximately twice the population it has today. So the infrastructure, one could argue, can handle that many more people in the context of our dense urban structure than it does today. The other longer-term issues that I'm going to be encouraging and pushing for are a couple of different issues that have been discussed over the years, one of which is a community land trust, which is a vehicle for holding land that can specifically be organized so as to reduce speculative pressures on the land separate the ownership of the land from the ownership of the building on the land. It has successfully been used in many communities, both here in New York State and elsewhere, to develop affordable housing in a way that preserves neighborhood value, keeps revenues and tax income local, and it's something that was brought up in a proposal actually here and approved by the City Council back in 2006. The sponsor of the legislation at that point was not able to continue with it, but the germ of the idea is there, and there are people in the community who were part of the steering committee at the time who I've spoken to, who would like to resurrect that idea and see where we can go with it as a tool for increasing the housing stock of the city and doing it in a way that keeps the prices reasonable for the people who need to live here. So that's the status of the city of Hudson situation.
Great. So I'm going to sum up a little bit about what I've heard, and then we're going to open it up. First, I just want to recognize that I know that there's this is an issue that really does cut deep to people. On the one hand, you have people who have lived here either a long time or potentially their entire lives who are really struggling to find a home in the place where all their friends and family live, the only place they know, and are looking at prospects of having to maybe move out of the city that they love because they just can't afford to live here. On the other hand, I also recognize that there's people who have invested a lot of their time and money and energy and emotional time to creating properties and to better the city, and are using Airbnb or using other rental mechanisms as part of their life. And so I understand there's a lot of people who have the best intentions, who maybe have some interests that are in conflict. And I think the one potential solution, which sort of Bill references, is coming up with regulations that encourage the kind of development that we want in a way that protects the most amount of people's interests. And I want to sum up a little bit about the stuff that we have talked about. So Bill mentioned sort of it's not necessarily about banning Airbnb, but it's coming up with specific regulations that encourage and legalize the kinds of rentals that we like, while I guess it's essentially banning the type of Airbnb that we might not want. And then Michael also referenced some specific sort of initiatives that the city either has taken or will be taking or might be taking to sort of encourage good housing. So you mentioned the lodging tax. He also mentioned sort of incentivizing rentals that might be more likely to be affordable, whether that means giving away sort of allowing people to not have to add additional parking spots in order to create more housing, or potentially allowing new types of housing like small garage units. Also maybe changing the zoning policy or doing comprehensive plans to allow for either larger units or smaller units that are currently allowed. And then also some sort of collectivizing where we're incentivizing or creating a mechanism where people can have more affordable housing, whether it's through a land trust or a land bank or something along those lines. So those are some of sort of the tactics that have been expressed. And in previous forums, we also addressed other sort of mechanisms that were less about short-term rentals. And we talked about working with developers to create this type of housing, and also some of the agencies that are currently in Hudson that are also working on affordable housing. So I kind of just wanted to set the table a little bit about some of the stuff that's been going on. So then we'll hear stuff from the floor, and then I guess I just request that everybody raise your hand one at a time, and we'll get through this. So. And there's probably a lot of people who want to speak, so I'm going to try to just make eye contact and keep a stack, so you don't have to keep your hand raised. So if you make eye contact with me and I nod, that means that I have you. And then I'm just going to keep going through the order. Okay, so does anybody want to talk at this point? Okay, Steve, I saw Deuce, Kaya. Okay, 4. All right, go ahead.
Hi, Steve down in Hudson. Bill, I really enjoyed your word picture of Woodstock. But as I interpreted what you said right now on the books Airbnbs are illegal, yet there are Airbnbs suggesting the code is not being enforced for whatever reason. And now you're talking about regulating them as to noise and whatnot, but not actually banning. So, ironically, as you change the code, you're legalizing. have I understood it, I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
No, not at all.
But there's kind of an irony going.
Well, I don't think it's an irony. First off, the gentleman asked, he mentioned that, right now the zoning law in Woodstock prohibits a lot of B&B or home rentals, full home rentals. If you are not on the property and it's a whole house, you can't rent it out. You can rent out, if you have a room or a section of a house, you can rent that out as long as you're present. We didn't put that section of the law in there to prohibit short-term rentals or Airbnbs. It just happened to be there many, many years ago. It's a tool we've had. Airbnbs are a problem, but that doesn't mean it's all a bad problem. There's a lot of really good parts to it, and that's why the town has been so reluctant to turn around and ban them. They're a great benefit to the town, but there's also a downside. And Airbnb, they called us up to have a conversation. They recognize that there are issues, that there are problems, that it's not all cookies and cake. And they're the first ones to suggest regulating them. So that's what we're looking at doing. Presently, you cannot rent a full house, but we recognize that that's important in Woodstock, and we're going to amend our zoning law at some point with regulations that will benefit everybody, including the neighbors. Keep in mind, if you go out and buy a house either here in Hudson or in Woodstock, and you use that to rent short term, that's not a residence anymore. It's become a business. And most zoning laws don't allow businesses to just crop up all over the place. They regulate them. They put certain restrictions on operation and so forth. So, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Can I just add one little thing? I mean, I think that what you were saying is that Airbnb, I think what is happening around the country is that
Can you speak up, please?
I'll try. I think what's happening around the country in cities that are regulating Airbnb is that Airbnb is, as I think what you said originally, they're eager to work with you on regulations because it legalizes it.
Airbnb reached out to Woodstock and said, we want to help you. We don't want to, I one day at a meeting, kind of half jokingly, half frustrated, said we should just ban them all. That was never my intent. And everybody in Woodstock knows that that's not what we're going to. Every time it comes up at a meeting over the last 2 years, and we talk to B&B owners, you own a B&B too?
Yeah.
Yes. Every time I've ended a conversation with them, they're all very relieved to hear my position, because it's not about banning. It's been a boom for Woodstock. I wouldn't think of getting rid of them, but there is a downside. There are problems, and some of the problems I think are going to correct themselves. Last year was just off the charts, and I know at least 15 people personally who are no longer Airbnb their homes. They're gone back to renting them full time because the B&B part was just too much work. So I think, I think a lot of people jumped into it. Again, there was some talk about 800 rooms. I don't think there was that much traffic. Probably 300 of them did really well, and a couple tried and gave up. So my guess is if we check today, it would be less than half that high number from two years ago.
Going forward, just quickly clarification. There's a big difference between Airbnb and B&B. Airbnb is a platform.
Yes.
A bed and breakfast is a legal entity. There are a number of us in Hudson who have bed and breakfasts. We are not necessarily on Airbnb. That's a platform. Perhaps we could be. But we need to make sure everyone understands the difference between Airbnb and a bed and breakfast, because there's a big difference.
What's
okay?
the difference?
A bed and breakfast in New York State means that you have it
It's
5
a
bedrooms.
rental.
What?
It's a
So
short-term
I want to get back. I just want to get back to the stack. So
I know
we can
you
go-
do, but I just thought it was worth explaining what the difference is for the people who don't know. So,
All right. So, okay. Just
Hi, my name is Marcus Neal. I'm been one of the councilmen since 12 years. I think so. We are not talking about Airbnb banning. Actually, lot of factors affected this housing. Factor was the number one factor is the Hudson city very small city. And number two factor is gentrification. One people coming to them buy the house, they live in one man, one house. That's the one factor. Airbnb also factor. Some of the houses leave there empty, that's factor too. So this multiple factor is facing the Hudson city. A couple of years ago, we tried to make an affordable housing in city property. City has a 12 property identified that we are trying to make in a CDPA try to make in a low affordable housing or low income housing. But we needed to build up, bring in the build up and build up that happens. Also, they have another progress county does it, housing study. This guy, but question is housing is a problem. One way BNB or Airbnb bring the economic person up, other way people pushed out for the Hudson, they cannot afford this living in Hudson. So we have to make any. I like to live, we have to make any like a mixed use Hudson. We have to make any like a build up, like a city has a 12 place, we have to make a 12 multiple building to make an affordable housing. We have to look at it. We should not target each other on that. And of course, you have to have some regulation. That's the important. But this is the tragedy is my 12 years we tried to make it talking about a couple of years ago that we make an affordable housing and technology. Sometimes we try to identify the city property, our council was shut up. That's true. I'm telling you that's true. So I like to say the main problem is housing, it should be affordable. Because if you make a housing that I cannot afford it, then I have to go. So we have to need affordable housing, low income housing. That's the important part. One way Hudson is economically good, everybody likes Hudson. I know a lot of people come in New York City. We love to see that too. But I don't say against them. But we have to, I don't want to see some of poor people push out from the Hudson. That's the important factor. We can blame the Airbnb, BNB, all these things. Okay, so please build up the affordable housing. They can poor people can live in Hudson. Thank you.
Just to sort of sum up, it's really important. I'm just saying it's really important that the city builds sort of provides infrastructure for more affordable housing, takes a more proactive approach, and be more successful at it in the future. You're next.
Yeah, I just want to ask a clarifying question before I say what I was going to say. Does anybody know where does the lodging tax specifically go to the tourism fund? That's what it had stated at some point.
Yes, a portion of it does.
Half of it.
Half of it, and then where does the other half go?
To the general fund.
Okay.
Right.
So one thing, and I think that kind of speaks to the larger concern that I have as someone who works with young people in the community and have lived around here for 15 years and watched the change happen. It seems like there's a lot of Airbnb and B&B, separate things, owners here tonight, and there's a lot of, I can almost feel like anxiety and fear in the room that people are going to come after your ability to make a living. And a lot of you, I'm going to venture to guess, chose to come to Hudson and you love it and you want to stay here and you want to be able to make a living, you don't want to lose what you have. And I want to just put that out there because it's kind of palpable. And I also think that that's a good segue into thinking about what it's like for people growing up here who have, their families have lived here for generations, their growing up in this community and want to stay in this community, want to raise families in this community, and what it feels like to realize that you can't stay here and that you can't afford anything. I work with teenagers who are graduating from college and, or high school and are like, can you help me find an apartment? I'm like, not in Hudson, but we could go look in some other towns. They can't stay, they're like, but I can't leave, like, this is where my family is where I work, like I don't have a car, what about, you know, like there is not enough places for people to live, and that has changed in the last few years. And to just speak directly to the point about when you remove, you know, 70 to 80 properties from the housing market, regardless of the value of those properties, even if they're for a higher rental value, it still affects the whole market. That's just sort of basic economics. And so it has had a huge effect. The same apartments that 10 years ago rented for $375 for a 2-bedroom on Washington Street now rent for $1,700. So it's extreme, and I've watched our community of young people and the same people that you probably like seeing in the community are leaving and we're losing them. So I just want to kind of like take some of the feelings that you're having and think about, a lot of people are here maybe tonight, I'm going to venture to guess, because you're concerned about protecting your Airbnb property, but are you here because you're concerned about protecting affordable housing in Hudson? And if we were to take away the chip of like somebody's going to come after your Airbnb and say, will you, if you are an Airbnb owner, be the loudest and most outspoken champions for affordable housing in our community? There are clearly some other solutions. Then we could do this together. But we actually need the folks who are profiting off of the lack of housing stock in Hudson to be at the forefront of the fight to build more housing stock in Hudson and to not be the ones who say, not in my backyard like they're doing in Woodstock. If we need to build a 200-unit building on the old ball field in the first ward, will you say yes or no because it's in the high-end part of town? We're not just going to keep building housing only in the corner of the second ward, or can we improve it? And so I do want to know, if you're going to say don't ban my Airbnb, what are you going to do to protect the rest of the community?
We'll be next, but you're first.
Hi, Marco Wingate. I am an Airbnb host, but I do not own the properties. I actually manage them for other people. These are all Airbnbs that are owner occupied. So I think there's still a lot of confusion for some people here. I just looked it up on my iPhone. There are 284 Airbnbs currently listed here in Hudson. Of those, 100 are shared. That means the owner lives there and only lets out one room. That means those are immediately off the potential affordable housing market, unless they would like to share with a roommate. But it's obviously
184. So then there's 184 that are not.
That is correct. Of those, I personally know about 40 where the people, it's their primary home, they commute, they work in the city, or they travel a lot, and they only rent it out if you actually go on the calendar, which I did prior to the meeting tonight, and to make sure that these are not just Airbnb houses, but they only are available 1 or 2 weekends a month when the owner is traveling, obviously having to spend money while they are elsewhere. So the real question is, how many real Airbnb, non-owner occupied places do we actually have in Hudson? It would be really, really helpful to continue this discussion once we have that actual information, because it's not 284. And also the 284 are not houses, they are rooms. So many of the local inns, hotels actually are listed on Airbnb. So some of them have 9 units. These are 9 units that are listed as individual properties on Airbnb. I just wanted to clarify that so that we can compare oranges to apples.
Yes, thank you. I guess I also want to clarify. I think there is a risk of of sort of like one bogeyman getting pointed at and being like, it's pretty clear there's like a problem with affordable housing, and we do have a risk of like pointing at one symptom or even imagined symptom and sort of exaggerating its impact. So I think it's good to sort of ground ourselves in numbers. I also think it's fair to project into the future and think about where's Hudson going to be 5 or 10 years from now. And there certainly is a scenario where, while these numbers might be now, we can imagine 5 or 10 years from now where the affordable housing stock continues to decrease, while the number of Airbnbs, as an example, could potentially continue to increase. So we should be at least a little more forward thinking than just looking at the data now, but also looking at other cities and being like, where could this go in 5 or 10 years? And we should start being proactive as a community, and also like asking our government to be proactive to sort of shape that direction. But I do hear that it's possible that people speak to specific numbers that might be inaccurate. Does that seem like a fair response? Okay. I just want to like keep this not going. So you're next, and then one of you guys want to respond. Go ahead. Yes.
Hi, I'm Marla Day.
Hey,
I do have an Airbnb, and I have an apartment for $500 a month. Part of what prompted me to attend was the announcement of Michael's portion in the home sharing. And I said, well, there's the operative word, and are we hearing it enough? The premise of Airbnb was home, not a building, not a house. It was an opportunity to welcome people into your community, shine a light on where you live, and have someone in your home. What a fluke, that I was able to do this, because, and I don't know if there's a correlation between the number of people paying property taxes, the fact that we're a county seat, and nonprofit tax exempt structures, but I understand by my checks, I've got a pretty high burden in terms of property tax. So the Airbnb has been a blessing to me, and I read this over and over again. But it is my home. And I mean, the benefits of living there are great, because some of my Airbnb people have bought in Hudson. You'd think I'd be a deterrent, but they bought anyway. When I hear of people that live on McKinn Street with 2 Airbnb units, I'm like, well, good for you. And they own a house on Robinson, it's strictly Airbnb, and there's a third property. That's when I start to bristle, thinking, go to vacation by owner. You don't have that $1 million protection under the Airbnb insurance rights. You might not have the same vetting. But if this is how you choose to turn it into an investment property, then I turn to our coffers and say, let's look at how to maximize taxes on someone basically running a mini hotel. But with regards to Airbnb, if it is our home, and I think there are innumerable rights that allow us to rent a room if we choose to. And I hate to think that I'm reducing it to semantics, or it's a house or a home, but I hope we have a common understanding that that is the simplistic form by definition. It's our home. If you have chosen to utilize Airbnb in any other format, then I challenge you to go back, and unfortunately we can't even go to Airbnb because they've gotten so greedy. They probably don't care how you're making money, because obviously they dropped Manhattan, and I couldn't believe for the first time in my life I actually felt for the landlords in Manhattan. Paying the property taxes and the water bills and all the services, and people were making money off their apartments. That was short-lived, however. That's all I wanted to say. I just hope that we get back to the definition of Airbnb. It is a home to be extended to a fellow traveler and to shine a light on our community. Right. And if you should benefit, I have yet to turn a profit. I got to stop buying my best wine. I just think there's so much potential for Hudson. And I would like to clearly see what buildings are on the tax rolls and why my property taxes are so skewed. But I believe that's a different topic. Thank you all for this panel.
Thank you. So if I also could just kind of sum up some of the key things that I heard, was that you feel like there are ways to do Airbnb that can be really beneficial to the community, and ways that will be less beneficial, and that might lead to the question that we could be regulating one type of, we could be encouraging one type and discouraging another type. Does that seem like an accurate summary?
If it's your home, it's yours. If it's not where you live as a home, I think by definition, it has to be evaluated in a different way.
Thanks.
And I brought my own cookie.
I just want to say, I think maybe I should have, in my introduction, underscored more clearly that at issue here, as far as we're concerned for affordable housing, is not the practice of renting out a room in your house or any sort of thing like that. Thank you.
You go ahead.
Is Section 8 housing affordable housing, or is that something completely different?
Yes, it's a program that supports low-income renters.
Yeah, and how much of that is there here in Hudson? How many rooms or how many apartments?
We've got Skyward Apartments, Jocelyn Commons, the high-rise, Hudson Terrace, and 90% of Phil Bell's properties where the shootouts all took place on State Street.
Right, but
So how many units would you say that might be? It varies though, doesn't it?
it varies because it includes places which are dedicated to that, like Bliss Towers, as well as portable Section 8 that goes with the renter. And they can go to any landlord and say, will you rent to me, and the government will fill in the gap between what I can afford and what you need to pay. So I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'm sure we can get those pretty easily.
I think Tom's raising his hand right to answer.
Yes, just because I happen to know those numbers.
Great.
The city has allotted 100 vouchers for affordable, for Section 8 housing, and only 68 are being used.
Right, well that's the portable version.
Well, that's what we're talking about, Section 8 vouchers.
Yes.
That's what I think you're...
And just to clarify, there's reason, I think some of them aren't being used because people have a voucher but they can't find a place to live as well, right? So there's actually a gap in housing, not a gap in need.
And there's a lot of barriers to be able to access it, like if you're fully incarcerated, or if you make just a little bit over, like if you get a second job and it's on the books, and some people have to try to get under the table jobs, so you can't like actually get a decent paying living wage job and afford to live in Hudson or qualify for Section 8. So if you fall in that in between, you're screwed.
Right, it's a pretty narrow window.
But Michael or Tom, the number that's been thrown around that I've heard repeatedly is that there's about 40 to 45% of the housing stock in Hudson is subsidized in one way or another. Is that an accurate number?
I haven't heard that number.
Okay, I don't know. That's the number that's sort of that there's about 50-55% of the population is of the housing stock is taxable, and that the balance.
Some of the housing stock is not taxed because it's like a nonprofit or a government entity, right? So
that could be.
So I wouldn't call that affordable housing because there's a nonprofit or a government building there.
Right, or church.
Right.
Yeah.
So Reverend Cross.
I tell this story wherever I go. You're gradually, slowly bumping us poor people out of here. You ask where will we be in 5 years? We won't be here. Okay, we're talking about bed and whatever. The whole thing is that I was born here. Okay, I got grandchildren, great-grandchildren here. I expect to be living in one of their houses when I turn 90, and then looking over me. But the way it stands, it's not going to be. It's not going to be that way, and it's hurting me. It's just hurting me and my people. You know, when I talk about my people, I'm talking about the poor. We talk about affordable housing. Affordable to whom?
I want to echo what Barbara said. I'm in a similar situation, but also what Reverend Cross was saying is that there are people I've even heard, like from California or wherever, and heard that Hudson's hot, and they buy some buildings and they fix them up like on Robinson and places like that. And they have nothing to do with the town. I guess that could happen anyway. I don't know if there's any way one can regulate it. But for me, just on many levels, is they don't have a commitment to the community, which I guess is what we're also regulating too, is saying it's one thing bring someone in your home to help you pay, your taxes and so forth. But there's another where you don't even care about this place, it's just a place to make money. And then your neighbor is not invested on any level. So yeah, I guess that's what I want to say. I think Airbnb is maybe one of the symptoms one can point to, but I really don't think it's any big a cause in itself. Thanks.
Simple observation. We're trying to solve the affordable housing problem. We haven't defined that. What is affordable housing? How do you solve it? One moment. I'm not finished. I'm not finished. The key to solving a problem, number one, is defining what the problem is. And if you don't do that, you start to shoot off in the wrong directions and say, well, this is the problem, and we haven't defined that very well. And I suspect it's very hard to define that, because we're finding people who live in Manhattan come here and say, this is a bargain. Yet we regularly see Facebook postings of people saying, how can I find a $500 apartment? But we have to wrap our head around what is affordable housing and what are we going to try to provide.
Right. So I would actually push back and be like, I'm not sure if we have to define it that specifically. And I think you could, in some ways it is relative, and I think we would look at our city, at least speaking from my own vision of how the city would work, is that there'd be people of a diversity of incomes, right? And so different people, and there are different technical types of affordable housing, where if you meet this income level or you have these kind of job situation, then you get into this kind of housing, and it's possible that you make too much money and you can no longer live in this type. But we could imagine a city that caters to a variety of income situations. And it's true that at our first panel we had a panel that was more technical, and it had leaders in affordable housing talking about creative affordable housing. One of the things that they recommended, one of the sort of the best practices for making affordable housing happen, is to have a study where you look at all the housing needs and you might identify these are the different types of affordable housing that we need or might need in the future, which could include the number of bedrooms an apartment would have, the number of income levels it's targeted at. And there might be, a whole variety of different types of affordable housing. And then basically you come up with a plan to say, well, we want all these different types. We need 4 of type A and 12 of type B. And so, that can be, an hours-long conversation being really specific about all the different types that one needs at this moment. But I think I think going forward, I think it's also fair to say that we want all these different types. And at that first forum, there was someone who was talking about how she has a decent state job, and I think she said she made $40,000 or $50,000 a year, which is certainly, that's not Section 8 housing. And she's like, I should be able to afford a place to live, and I have to live with I'm not sure if she said her parents or her family, because she can't find a place at $40,000 or $50,000. And so people who are making $40,000 or $50,000 should be able to find housing in Hudson. That's the city I want to live in. But also people who are making less than that should also be able to find housing in Hudson. So I think as a community, I think that's how I look at affordable housing. Does that make sense to you?
We're not part of it.
Right. I want to make sure I'm getting people who haven't spoken yet. So one, Billy. Yeah.
It seems like a part of that we're not really talking about is sort of the tax base.
Can you stand up?
Sure. I think we're not talking about the tax base, because if you divide the taxes on certain houses that have maybe moved from what was affordable housing, the person bought it 20 years ago for $17,000, never did any work on it. Their taxes were a certain amount. If a person comes in and fixes it up, then it's suddenly it's not affordable anymore. It takes it off the market. But we're not talking about the tax base at all here. In relation to affordable housing, we're sort of going after Airbnb as this evil thing, and I kind of don't get that.
Well, I think what we're really talking about is rent when we're talking about people being able to find literally, affordable rents, and that of course is a relative term. So that's really what.
But I do understand what he's saying. He's talking about. He's saying you make an improvement on a house, it raises the value. You're paying a lot more taxes. The homeowner can't necessarily. Certainly, the homeowner, if they have made these improvements, can then not afford to keep it at a rate it once was, because you're now paying an extra $6,000. I mean, it goes up that much.
So I think it is fair to say that property taxes are part of the piece. I mean, there are many homeowners who talk about the challenges of living in their home because of property taxes. And I also think that the ability for the city to do good work also depends on the city having income, primarily from property taxes. So, like, I think property taxes is a piece that makes sense. And I guess I do want to avoid, you said like we're treating Airbnb like it's the bad guy, and that is not, I guess that's not my intention to be up here being like, Airbnb is the...
It's just some of the language, like, it's the problem in this school, what is it doing to the community together? As if it's like doing
a
something
scourge.
really awful to the community, rather than saying they may be doing some good things too. So it's just, it seems a little, it doesn't seem balanced really, the four of them.
Right, okay. I'm hearing that. And I think there definitely are people in the city who do look at Airbnb sort of as a, like, sort of as a more nefarious force. And that might be like an inaccurate presentation, but I think in some ways, given the lack of housing stock, I think oftentimes people sort of lash out at the most visible like forces that are taking away housing stock. And I do think Airbnb is certainly one of those ways that we could be losing housing stock, especially like the non-owner occupied variety of rentals. But I hear you that it's also a lot of Airbnb rentals are owners are putting a lot of good work into the community. Okay, so raise your hands. I want to take it to go.
Hi, Brian Lear. How would you classify a non-owner occupied? I have a client that has 2 places, and he stays here, I don't know, on average maybe 3-4 months out of the year, on and off, weekends, whenever it's not occupied. I mean, what would you be able to do about that? 1, 2. Airbnbs have brought a lot of money to Hudson. The people that need affordable housing, they're not shopping Warren Street. They can't afford Warren Street. So they're going to go out to that now.
Let's let them finish.
Yeah, that was one time USA. It's not anymore.
I'm scared.
I'm scared. The times have changed.
All right.
I just want to point out, you're asking like, how do we define owner occupied? And I think in some ways like that it's sort of up to us, right? Like we can define, if we decide to go down the route of regulating what kind of housing we want or what kind of housing we want to encourage, it's up to us to decide sort of like these nitty-gritty details. But it's a good point to be like, not all these things are super clear.
Right.
But I also think that we should, in my view, be creating a city that does serve everybody, and it's not just for people who can afford to shop in certain places. I think like the city we want is people who can, like whether or not you shop on Warren Street, you should be welcome here. At the same time, we should recognize that tax dollars does create a benefit to the city, so we should be encouraging tax dollars, but we should also be encouraging residents to live here who can't necessarily afford that.
Well, I came to the meeting today thinking affordable housing was what you guys were just talking about, and all I've heard is like Section 8. So is it affordable housing for people also that are working and making a living that should be able to buy in Hudson or close by to Hudson?
Yeah.
I grew up here.
That is what we were talking about. She just asked about Section 8, but we were talking about all kinds of affordable housing. That was mentioned.
No, but he was talking
he
about
spoke
somebody
the
that makes
whole time about
$450,000 a year. They can't afford a house in Hudson.
Let's keep moving.
Can I just add one thing to that question? In Woodstock, what we're looking at is whether it's owner occupied or not, basically whether the owner has a presence all the time. Now that doesn't mean they have to be on the property 24/7, but basically that they're renting out a portion of the house. Like if there was a woman in the back there where she's renting out a room or two. That would be owner occupied. Where someone's got a house and they're vacating the house and renting it to you, whether it's just for the weekend or not, that's non-owner occupied.
Doesn't that go into primary home or secondary home, right? Because there's also...
No, it's whether you're on premises.
It's whether you have a presence. And again, you might step out for the weekends, but you're renting a portion of that house. You're not giving them the run of the house. And at the moment, that's how we're defining it.
So, Mona and Christine, I see your hands raised, but I do want to give people a chance who haven't spoken yet. That seems like a more fair way to go. So, Billy, and 3 and 4. Okay.
So, I heard a lot of talk about people talking about the numbers, what's considered affordable housing. I've been doing a lot of work on this for about a year. So, I certainly can't units there. That housing is specifically for people who has a working income and it varies in range. Then when you look at Bliss Towers is a low-income Section 8 voucher home that is run by HUD. There's about 120 units inside of Bliss Towers. And then counting the units on the outside, so altogether there's about 132 units total. Those are rent subsidized, varying. Some people pay almost no rent, and there's people in there that are paying about $500 or $600 a month. And then when you get into Hudson Terrace, there's 164 units, and that is actually owned by a nonprofit who has received a pilot from Hudson, and is totally voucher subsidized. So you have people in there who are paying anywhere from, again, $35 a month, as far as $1,000 a month. I know people who live in Hudson Terrace that work at Brookwood are making a very good salary, and they pay a pretty good rent. Kamal brought that up as an example, as he was in Hudson Terrace, and as his salary went up, his rent went up. So it made it unaffordable for him to live there. So when we throw out the term affordable housing, not all that housing stock that we see in Hudson is affordable if your salary continues to increase. Now, the gentleman up front said, well, how do we determine what affordable housing is? The federal and state standard says if you pay more than 30% of your income, the housing isn't affordable. So that's how you determine affordable. And right now, we're working on information to determine what the median income in the city of Hudson is. We think we have the information, but that's what I'll let the mayor bring that out.
I just wasn't clear on how many buildings now are just being Airbnb or B&B without owner living in there. Barbara was mentioning, but...
So I think Ruth has some... What I had seen was a number of 90 units in 30 buildings.
That don't have owners living there.
So okay, 90. So the question was how many non-owner occupied Airbnb units are there? And Michael estimates 90 units.
The number I've seen judging from the list of about 90 units comprising 30 different buildings.
That's right.
That's from the lodging tax rolls.
Yes.
The lodging tax rolls only has
And those are
113
also bed
units.
and breakfast and hotel rooms. I just want to underline that. So
No,
Not?
No.
Because I counted also.
The lodging tax rolls do list bed and breakfast.
Also on the
and
lodging
there's-
tax?
Well,
Yeah.
no argument there.
Yeah. There's only 113 units on the lodging tax rolls.
Oh.
There are at least 150 full unit rentals. So a lot of people are just not on the lodging tax rolls yet.
Ah.
Great, it better be.
They better be.
Okay. So
My concern is that it seems as if it's already out of balance. The rents are already up there. It's already unaffordable for so many people. And, you're saying we want people to feel welcome here. Well, the people who are the welcomers are the ones who are being forced out. And what can we do to... this has been going on for years, so...
I hear your question. Yeah. So I guess to kind of some like really broad strokes about what we can do for affordable housing, I think is kind of your question is that. So in the first forum, we sort of identified these like key steps to say, well, one is that we can issue some sort of comprehensive affordable housing plan and be like, look, we have all these different kinds of housing that we need to do, and we're going to do them all. That way, another option is like we do have properties that the city owns. What can the city do to just like start developing those other properties? I think there's also like some very ambitious, like broader scheme plans that the city has in collaboration with the county, and in some ways, like we need to kickstart those. Like they should have been done 5 or 10 years ago, and we need to. It's not like part of the reason why we're doing these forums is to sort of bring attention to like. I think there was already like on the street a lot of interest in affordable housing, and this is like one way to sort of make it more palpable and to sort of bring people together. And it's like we're not like we don't necessarily have control over this on our own, but if we all band together and sort of continue to make this an issue, it's something we can do. There's some steps that was also identified at that first forum, like if we want to have we have properties that we think will eventually be affordable housing, like can we go ahead and start doing like the environmental reviews and get some of the paperwork ready so that way when a developer is so when kind of everything's sort of ready as possible for a developer to kind of come in and partner with us to develop affordable housing. The second forum was focused on sort of providers of affordable housing and sort of them talking about their current work. And so I also think that we can be talking to those agencies that are providing affordable housing and saying, you know, how can we help? And also, you know, like we want you to do more. What can we do? So some like really broad strokes about those are like things that were sort of in conversation. And then I think there was also another piece of a feeling that is that short-term rentals either are currently or could become also sort of like a hindrance in affordable housing as they have the potential to sort of continue to increase the market. And so is there a way for us to sort of head that off and sort of encourage the type of housing that we want and discourage the type of housing that we don't want? And I guess I'd also add sort of all those like things that like Michael talked about in the beginning, like the lodging tax, the vacancy tax, the land trust. Like there are also sort of other ideas that are either sort of have been completed or sort of are being worked on. And so it's like, you know, teaming up with Michael or your council member, being like, how can I help? So I don't know. I guess that's sort of like a quick summary of some of the things that we can do. And then sign up on the list and remember Rebecca will be in touch with you and we'll like keep this going. Thanks. And then, yes.
First, I'd just like to say that this is one of the reasons I really appreciate Hudson, is because we can all get together, coming from many different standpoints, and have a very diversified population, and try to figure something out, which is a very complicated equation. I am I don't live in my Airbnb. I run an Airbnb. I live in Germantown. I bought a building on State Street back in 2004. I bought my house in Germantown in 2000. I did so. I've been self-employed all my life, and I knew that I wanted to invest in Hudson. And it was way before Airbnb, and I didn't really know that's how it would come to be. I had, my building came with tenants who remained at their original rent in my building for 14 years. And I gave them 5 years notice that I was going to have to invest in the building. I mean, they did nothing to the building. The floor was going to fall down, you know, and understood they were living their lives. I just don't know if, I mean, I know that the point is not to eradicate Airbnb, but I don't think that that's the exclusive issue that would propagate more affordable housing. You know, I think that I've put a great deal of effort. My job is my Airbnb. I drive for, you know, I take care of it. It's not passive income, I can assure you. It's a lot of hard work, and I put tens of thousands of dollars into my building, which I'm quite proud of on State Street. And it is lovely to see Hudson, you know, to see people investing in their property. And ironically, my tenants seem to be, or my guests seem to be quite impeccable. And if anything, they on occasion will complain about the fact that the neighbors next door started drinking at 7 a.m. and are smoking cigarettes under their window. And we're all, you know, we all have to get along. But really, and I do think it's a complicated equation. I really appreciate what you had to say. I am interested in Hudson maintaining its diversification and having many different kinds of people who can all find their way here. You know, I don't want to be part of the problem. I just don't believe that Airbnb is the enemy exclusively. I think that the people who come and stay in my Airbnb are, they're not wealthy people. They're coming here with the thought of maybe moving here, maybe raising a family here. They come for weddings. There's so many, I mean, anybody who works in the wedding industry, who has a shop here, who has a restaurant, who works in a restaurant, Airbnb is what makes it all possible, really. It has become a destination, and it's unrealistic to think that Hudson is not going to be faced with these kinds of challenges, because time does not stand still. I was attracted to Hudson because I grew up on Nantucket, and Hudson reminded me of Nantucket. Let me assure you, I was outpriced of Nantucket. And you know, I can cry about it. That was the love of my life, that island. And I hope that, you know, I don't want to see Hudson become Nantucket, that's for sure. But I just think it's important to also not just vilify
the accommodations that are not just the problem, but part of the growth of Hudson.
Right, so what I'm hearing is that you're an Airbnb owner who is like really concerned and dedicated to the community of Hudson.
I am.
And you feel like you and your guests and your business is like helping put Hudson in a better place. And you're worried about being vilified.
I really do.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Mara. I'm 34 years old and I've worked with the service industry for 20 years here. It's the first time in my life I qualified to get a mortgage. I rent on State Street. I live in between two Airbnbs. One of them I used to rent for $800 per month. But anyway. It's weird. I think Airbnbs are cool. I stay in them in other cities with my family. What concerns me as a local who wants to participate in Hudson and this growth that we're experiencing now is just the rate. And it would make me feel better if I knew what percentage each ward was going to Airbnbs, what percentage of each ward was going to be vacant for most of the month. I feel more comfortable buying a home here knowing I'm not going to live next to two empty buildings. I value family and community and Airbnbs. I just want to know, like, can we please figure out a way to just cap the rate so that people like me who do have an income and can barely afford to buy a house but can still buy a house here, can we stay and not be living next to empty homes?
Right, so what I'm hearing is that the concept or even the practice of Airbnb, there's a lot of ways where it could be really good, but there's a way that there's scenarios of Airbnb that are not desirable and that could prevent it.
It's just the rate, we're watching another boom. Like locals have experienced booms here over eons. We're watching another boom, and it's just like okay, but can we sustain our economy this time, please?
So let's take just a couple more questions or comments, and then we can call it a wrap. People can sort of hang around and talk accordingly. Okay, so one.
Michael.
Well, you've spoken a few times.
I've not expressed an opinion. I was clarifying things. I have two really important things to say.
Okay, so who would like to get the last? So 1, 2, 3, and then we'll call it. You want to close it out?
Kind of.
Okay, let's do that. All right, we got a plan. Hope everybody likes it.
I think that when we talk about Airbnb, I don't think that anybody is trying to vilify Airbnb. Airbnb is not a person, it's not a building. It creates a lot of benefits. I have traveled with Airbnb before. I really enjoy it as a traveler. I think that if you live in a home and you go out of town for a month, or you have just a room and you would like to rent it out sometime, it offers a great way to check to see that you can trust, get payment from the people who are going to be staying with you. It provides a lot of benefits, but if we don't put some reasonable locks on the way that it's used, we do create a situation where, we have altered the rental market and made it difficult for people to live here. I was speaking to somebody who works in housing in Hudson who said that the hospital routinely has trouble getting housing for people who are working at CMH because our rental market is skewed too high. I would much rather see people live here and be part of the community 7 days a week than just come and visit for 2 days a week. And Bill McKenna and I used to live in Woodstock, and we were lamenting that, when a small town becomes too dependent on a tourist economy, you create a situation where there's not a lot of opportunity for people who are growing up in that town to stay in that community unless they want to work at a restaurant or at a bar. That's not a great way to build a community. We want to have a diversified economy. We want to be able to have the housing available that attracts multiple companies in different kinds of industries. And I think that that's really important for building a healthy community.
I think there's two other things we need to think about. And we're talking about affordable housing. The other side of the equation is is job and job creation in this community, because if we don't have jobs, how can anyone afford any kind of housing, regardless if it's $200 a month or $1,000 a month? And I think you cannot isolate the conversation and just talk about housing. You've got to broaden it, because it's a whole socio-economic, political question that we need to address. So that was the first thing. The second thing I think is also very important, and I would say, I have a bed and breakfast in Hudson. I have been here for 4 years. I'm on the corner of 5th and Columbia. There are 4 brick townhouses. I am the only one that is occupied. They were built in 1866, and the other 3 are empty. One of them is owned by Galvan, one of them is owned by a woman who has a very nice bed and breakfast out in Hillsdale, and the last one on the end is actually being renovated right now by someone in Hudson. But I have been here for 4 years and looked for a year, and so for 5 years, all those other houses have been empty. So the second issue is, how many buildings are there in Hudson that are potential residential buildings that people are paying? Oh, and I'm probably paying one of the top 5 taxpayers on North 5th Street, because I've got a house that's been occupied since 1998, and so I'm paying taxes. And all these houses that are empty next to me, I went and looked at the tax roll, and some of them are paying like $1,000 or something. I'm paying $13,000 in taxes for my house. And, you know, we've got all these empty houses in town, and we need to figure out how to incentivize the people who own them to fix them up so that they can become additional affordable housing. So between trying to find some jobs and trying to get the houses that are being warehoused, you know, those are 2 things I think that are a really important part of this bigger conversation. So.
Great, thank you. I was going to kick it over to Michael to talk about you want to talk about the vacancy tax?
No. Okay, it's still in development.
All right, so
Yeah.
So
I don't want to raise the issue.
all right. So there might be plans to address some of those.
Just
issues.
that, yes.
So there might be plans to address. The council is like discussing plans to address some, incentivizing people to not have vacancies.
Right.
But I guess we're not talking about it yet. No.
Yes, that was exactly what I wanted to also mention. The big pink elephant that's sitting right here in the room, the incredible amount of unoccupied houses and buildings and apartments in the city. I live on the corner of Warren and 2nd Street. A perfectly wonderful 2-bedroom, affordable apartment was being renovated last year. The family that lived there were given 30 days notice. A 2-bedroom apartment for $850 a month, including heat. Guess what? There's still nobody living there because they haven't gotten anything down there. Ripped out the kitchen. So who on earth can afford 14 months rent-free when there are so many people looking for a 2-bedroom? There should be some kind of penalty. It's disgusting. And I don't like living in a house where there are random people coming in and going. I never know when I'm going to be woken up at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning because finally the contractors are showing up to only disappear again for 6 weeks. And having dust falling down. There must be, if somebody files for a renovation, can we have some sort of a limit? All right, we think it's going to be done in 3 months. After 4 months, there's a fine. Bingo.
So I think the answer is more or less yes, there could be. And so I think the council is discussing something along
Please,
those lines.
would you discuss that? And, you know, can we also talk about the Galvin hoarding issue? Because really, there are about 60, 70 buildings in this town. Many of them are multi-families. And why are they not getting ready a little bit faster?
So I think we're going to move into closing up. I wanted to see if the panelists wanted to give any final statements, and then Rebecca will close it out.
You know, I would thank Rebecca for inviting me up here. It's been interesting tonight. It's given me some food for thought. And, you know, I just want to reiterate that I haven't heard anybody here today talk about short-term rentals. And that's really what we should be talking about. Airbnb is a company, it's a platform. There are all types of short-term rentals. They're not the evil boogeyman. They're a great benefit, but they do have problems and issues that need to be dealt with. I would just strongly advise you, B&B people, to be involved in the solution. And I know that in Woodstock, I have a committee of 6 or 7 looking into this, and 3 of them are Airbnb folks using that very platform. We want them involved because we want this to succeed and make our community better. But you shouldn't forget that it is a real problem. And I'll end with one story. My son, in his senior year, his best friend, it was actually the summer between junior and senior year, his best friend who had rented a home with his mother for 5 or 6 years. The owner passed away, and her daughter came back, and she said, oh, you know what, I'm going to make more money with Airbnb, and kick them out with 30 days notice. And, you know, this is America. It's capitalism. That's their right. But that woman could not find a place to live in Woodstock and ended up having to move up to Greene County. That young man had to commute back and forth. Auntie Ora kind of turned a blind eye and didn't really ask about residency and let him finish his last year. And that was a real hardship. And it was because everybody saw a golden opportunity with the short-term rentals. And it, you know, a rising tide rises all boats. So it's an issue that needs to be dealt with. Thanks.
No.
I'm just going to say thank you so much to the youth department. I forgot to mention and so much to Michael and Bill, and all of you for sitting here for so long and speaking so eloquently. I do think, you know, what I tried to illuminate in my introduction is that I do think there are ways to move into a place, whether you're actually living in that place or just investing, as this one described, in a place that are more sensitive to the existing community and what's going on in that community. And that's, I think, what this is really about, is like, you know, I refuse to believe that there's anything inevitable about anything. But given that we live in this town and it is doing what it has done, at least so far, I still think there's the capacity to examine oneself, examine how you do things, examine what it means to others. So,